So, in this chapter on fundamental rights, now I would like to discuss the doctrine of severability and doctrine of eclipse. Doctrine of severability and doctrine of eclipse. So, both these doctrines or the rule of severability and this doctrine of eclipse, it emerges from Article 13 and judicial review. So, this is an offshoot of this judicial review, because Article 13, 1 and 2 says that any law or any law which is inconsistent with the provisions of Part 3, any law which is inconsistent with Part 3, any law which is inconsistent with Part 3 of the Constitution shall be declared void. It has to be declared invalid to the extent of such inconsistency. Shall be declared void. One second. Shall be any law which is inconsistent with Part 3 shall be declared void to the extent of inconsistency. So, to the extent of that inconsistency, that law should be declared invalid. So, this doctrine of severability comes into picture. Sever means cut and remove. Please remember, sever is cut and remove. Severing, cutting and removing. Okay, sever the portion means cut and remove that portion. See, now imagine a scenario where an old law, imagine a 1930 law. I am giving an example. I am giving a crude example. Suppose a law, hundreds of maybe sentences or provisions, say many pages are there, many provisions are there in the law. Now, Article 13 says any pre-constitutional law, if it violates the fundamental rights, that law should be declared invalid to the extent of that inconsistency. Imagine, say, one sentence of that law violates, say, Article 19. Article 19 is a right to freedom of speech and expression. See, the whole law is there, it is working well, it worked for 20 years, it reached 1950, new constitution came into being, fundamental rights came into being, then it was found that this law is a good law. Everything was fine with this law, but now what is happening, because of the presence of fundamental rights, one sentence or one provision of that law is violating fundamental rights. Now the question is, Article 13 says this law shall be declared invalid immediately to the extent of inconsistency. Now, when you so now the question is, shall we declare the whole law invalid, or shall we just remove that much portion which is violating the fundamental rights invalid? So, shall we cut and remove only that much portion? So, Supreme Court or the doctrine of severability says that if the valid sections of the law can be severed from the void sections. So, the doctrine of severability says this invalid or rather this portion which is violating should be cut and removed, and the rest should be declared valid. So, what is doctrine of severability? Doctrine of severability says if the valid sections can be severed from the void sections, void means inconsistent, void sections, then and if such valid sections can be considered to form an independent law, see after severing, if the valid section continues to be an independent one, and if the valid sections can be considered as an independent statute or independent law, statute, if the valid section can be considered as an independent statute, then we say that these sections, that valid sections will remain valid, and this is called doctrine of severability. And these sections, so the valid sections will remain, the valid sections will remain it will remain operational, or it is remain enforceable. So what are we saying? If, please listen again, if the valid sections can be severed from the void sections, and if the valid sections can be considered as an independent statute, these valid sections will remain operational or remain functional. This is what is called doctrine of severability. So the process of cutting and removing those invalid sections and segregating the invalid sections from the valid section and declaring only that portion which is valid as operational, this is called doctrine of severability. So Supreme Court, while using Article 13 and judicial review, doctrine of severability comes into picture. Now, Supreme Court, that means Supreme Court will take up only the valid area and it will declare those invalid portions as invalid and separate it, cut and remove. So some what you call filtering will be done. In the filtering, only the valid portions will be taken and the invalid portions will be removed, and the rest of the law will be declared valid, or rather the rest of the law will be declared operational. Now, but there are certain cases where Supreme Court will not. Now, I am just talking about the exception, or where all Supreme Court or the court or high courts refuse to use doctrine of severability. If the doctrine of severability is not used, that means the whole law will be declared invalid. In severability, what is happening? The valid sections will be separated from the invalid section, and that much portion which is valid will be declared operational and valid. So, if doctrine of severability is not used, then what will happen? The whole law will be declared invalid. The whole law will be declared invalid. If Supreme Court refused to use doctrine of severability, then the whole law will be declared invalid because it is violating fundamental right. So, where all Supreme Court refused to use doctrine of severability, that is what. See, now in this there are many instances. Number one, the intention of the legislature. The intention of the legislature. If the Supreme Court feels that the legislature, the parliament or the state legislatures made this law knowingly that it is violating the fundamental rights, if they are knowingly doing it, if the intention is malicious, or other, if the intention, if they have a wrong intention, if the legislature made a law, enacted a law knowing fully well that the rest of the statute is invalid, knowingly they did this, then Supreme Court may say that the whole law is invalid because the intention of the lawmaker. If it is a by mistake, by accident, if inadvertently, especially if a post-constitutional law, if they are making it deliberately, Supreme Court will declare the whole law invalid. Number one, the intention of the lawmaker, the legislature, is very important. Number two, if the valid and the invalid sections are inextricably mixed up. Inextricably mixed up, meaning it is fully thoroughly mixed up. It is very difficult to distinguish. Then the whole law will be declared invalid, because where all doctrine of severability will not be used, if the valid and invalid sections are inextricably mixed up, then the whole law will be declared invalid. Number three, if valid and invalid form part of a single scheme, if valid and invalid are part of a single scheme, the whole law will be declared invalid. Number four, if the invalid, after omitting the invalid portions, after omitting the invalid sections, and what is remaining is very thin, and what remains is very thin or very, very different, very thin or very different, then the whole law will be declared invalid. If what, after omitting the invalid sections and what remains is very thin or very different, then the whole law will be declared invalid. So please remember, the point here is Article 13 says any pre-constitutional law or post-constitutional law, if it violates the fundamental rights, that much portion which is violating should be declared invalid. Now, doctrine of severability is the process in which Supreme Court distinguishes or separates the valid and invalid portion, and so it is if the valid portion can be severed and taken separately from the invalid portions, and if the valid sections can be considered as an independent statute, then the valid sections will remain operational and the invalid sections will be omitted out. This process is known as doctrine of severability. And I also said where all this doctrine of severability will not be applied. So that is in exceptional cases where the intention of the lawmaker is also looked into. If the valid and invalid sections are inextricably mixed up, then we will not use the doctrine of severability. If valid and invalid form a single scheme, we will not use doctrine of severability. If after omitting the invalid section and what remains is very thin or very different, very thin or very different, then again we may not be using doctrine of severability. Now, the opposite of doctrine of severability is doctrine of eclipse, or now it's a different concept altogether, doctrine of eclipse. So again, you please see, again I am repeating that severability part. So a good law, a law was there, it was in practice. Then fundamental rights came in 1950, fundamental rights. I am just giving a crude example now. And we found that one section of that particular law is declared invalid or severability was applied. Why? Because of the presence of a fundamental right, say Article 19 or any other article for that matter. Now, imagine a scenario, now this was a good law. The entire law was very good till the fundamental rights came, and it became inconsistent with the fundamental right. Imagine that particular fundamental right because of which this portion was removed. If that fundamental right itself is removed from the constitution after some time, say Article 31, this is a crude example, this is not the right example, but still, say because of Article 31, if that particular section was removed or severed, now the question is, say in 1978, we removed Article 31. Article 31 is no more a fundamental right. Now the question asked is, what will happen to the old law which was removed because of the presence of, say, Article 31? Supreme Court's argument is, since Article 31 has gone now, so the old law will come back to life. The old law will come back to life. It was removed because of the presence of a particular fundamental right. That particular fundamental right has gone now. So the old law should come back to life, and Supreme Court has come up with this concept of doctrine of eclipse. Thereby, Supreme Court says that this law was not completely dead, it was only in coma. Now this, the eclipse has gone, what was on top, fundamental rights came, so that is why this law was forced to be declared invalid. Now since that particular fundamental right has gone, so this old law will come back to life. That is what he is calling it as, doctrine of eclipse. So Supreme Court in Bikaji Narayan versus State of Madhya Pradesh case, Supreme Court in Bikaji Narayan R-A-I-N versus State of Madhya Pradesh in 1955 talked about or propounded this doctrine of eclipse. Doctrine of eclipse. And it clarified that any law which was severed, any law which was severed was not completely dead. It is not completely dead. It was only overshadowed by the presence of fundamental rights. Please note that severed portion was overshadowed. Overshadowed by the presence of fundamental rights, and it remained dormant. Overshadowed by the presence of fundamental rights and remain dormant. So it was not completely dead. It was not dead altogether. In fact, it was overshadowed by the fundamental rights and it remained. Now this shadow has been removed. When this fundamental right itself has been removed, the shadow has been removed. So it was a good law. It was a good law till the fundamental rights came. Now it has become a bad law. Why? Because fundamental rights came. And this particular fundamental right, if it is removed subsequently, that old law which is good will come back. The shadow has been removed. When the shadow cast by the fundamental right is removed by the subsequent amendment, the eclipse part or eclipsed part of such a law get revived and revised and effective again. So when the shadow cast by the fundamental rights is removed by a subsequent amendment, when the shadow cast by the fundamental rights is removed by a subsequent amendment. The eclipsed part, that means that severed part, or the eclipsed part of that law will get revised, or it revived will get revived and it becomes effective. It becomes effective once again. This is known as the process of the Supreme Court or the higher court to make that law, the process of the Supreme Court or the High Court which revived the old law, which is declared invalid, which is severed, which is declared invalid because of the presence of a fundamental right, is known as Doctrine of Eclipse. So if a particular law, if a ordinary law or a pre-constitutional law or a post-constitutional law, if it violates fundamental rights, Supreme Court can declare it invalid and it can be severed and removed and thrown away. It can be declared void. But if the fundamental right because of which this law was severed is removed in a subsequent amendment of the Constitution, the old law which was removed will come back to life. This is called Doctrine of Eclipse. So in fact, the Supreme Court gave this, earlier Supreme Court said that this is applicable to pre-constitutional laws. But subsequently, that means in 1974, a state of Gujarat versus the Ambika Mills case, in the Ambika Mills case, 1974, Supreme Court declared that Doctrine of Eclipse can be extended to post-constitutional laws as well. In the Ambika Mills case, Supreme Court declared that the Doctrine of Eclipse can be extended to post-constitutional laws, can be extended to post-constitutional laws as well. So, Article 13 brings in judicial review and any law which is violating the fundamental rights can be declared invalid, even a portion of it. If a portion of a law is violating fundamental right, only that much portion will be cut and removed and declared invalid. This is called doctrine of severability. But subsequently, in a subsequent amendment, if the fundamental right itself has been removed, because of which the severability, the doctrine of severability is applied, that all the removed portion can come back to life, it will be brought back to life. This is known as doctrine of eclipse. So, it is a very important concept. Many questions are asked. In preliminary it can be asked, in the main exam it can be asked, the distinguish between doctrine of severability or rule of severability and doctrine of eclipse. Very important. Please be prepared. Please practice also. So, that is all about doctrine of severability and doctrine of eclipse.